These first two slides, though, are just the face of modern terrorism. Some of those people you might recognise. Obviously, Dr. Zawahiri up in the top left, who's now the Al-Qaeda leader, for example. Ibrahim al-Aziri, who's the bomb maker for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Anders Behring Breivik. Hafiz Mohammed Saeed, who's the head of Lashkar-e-Taiba. And then you can see Abu Bakr Bashir trying to sort of peer through. These are others who are prominent these days. The Haqqani network on the left, with Jalaluddin, who's the father, and Sirajuddin, the son. Nasser al-Wuhayshi, who's the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Abu Musa Abdul Wadud, who's the head of Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. Abu Dua, who is the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Dawood Ibrahim, who is a leading crime figure in the Middle East. Anyway, comparing 10 years ago and today, if you took 9/11 as a year, which would actually be sort of the year that, because obviously the year you're looking at is the year before this one in terms of data, then you could add maybe 3,000 or so to that number, but still well below the numbers of people being killed these days, which is now around the sort of the 12,500 mark every year. What's really changed though is where people are being killed, and as you can see, now the focus is more on places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Nigeria, India, and so on. It's interesting to note there are no Western Alliance countries in there other than Norway and Greece. Norway, of course, because of Anders Behring Breivik, and Greece because it has a number of small attacks which don't figure in the deaths area, but they are sort of Marxist activities in Greece. Anyway, what I'm going to cover this evening is what has made life more difficult for terrorists, what the international drivers are today, the situation from a terrorism or terrorist perspective, what they don't have to worry about, the main areas of innovation, and what's going to affect our future ability to contain terrorism. So, terrorism can actually be perpetrated by nation states, by groups and individuals. I'm only going to focus tonight on groups and individuals, not on states, for the reason that states it's a bit contentious about who the actors are, so I'm going to steer clear of that one. And not much gets done about states that are terrorist states anyway, or supporters of terrorism. So what's made life more difficult for terrorists? Obviously we've got much better intelligence these days about terrorism and terrorist groups. We've got much better airport and seaport screening, improved CT, counter-terrorism response capabilities, more effective use of our special forces. There are better counter-terrorism capabilities in regional countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, and better protective security systems more generally. So, as an example of the intelligence side of things, this was a case where Britain penetrated, or the SIS penetrated, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which was reported in the Telegraph. This is an example of the screening processes we have now. Millimetre wave screening is coming in at the airports, and for modesty you can now buy these special underwear that blocks out the signal, which is of course a concern because you could also hide explosives underneath the fig leaf there. It's actually got impregnated with metal, so it actually blocks out the signal. So it's a bit of a concern from a security point of view. Special forces, of course, they've become much more professional. Police on the left and military on the right. This is Detachment 88 in Indonesia, based at Semarang. Very well resourced and very effective. The only problem is they never take any prisoners, which is not good from an intel point of view. They always find a reason to kill people instead of taking them prisoner. And some of them are becoming much more motorized. This is the Chinese CT capability, preparing for the Olympics. And of course barrier systems, become much more effective in this area as well. So we've become much more competent at stopping large vehicles from getting anywhere near facilities these days. We're going to build a new embassy in Jakarta, which will be on a green site, just try and stop that sort of capability. Continuing with the theme of what's made life more difficult for terrorists, Obviously, continuing decline in Western military commitments in Muslim lands, which have been somewhat of a driver for terrorism. I think maybe Muslim diaspora communities are becoming more nationalistic and less tolerant of extremists. There's better risk management processes these days. Use of drones for surveillance and killing, which you might not sort of agree with, but have been quite effective in terms of taking out key individuals. Targeted killing of terrorist leaders, and the only countries that engage in that are the US, Israel and Russia. Just to give you an example, with Afghanistan, of course, the drawdown is to be handing over to the Afghans by the end of 2014. Reality is they're not going to be ready by then. So what we'll see is accommodations and maybe partition, that sort of thing, in the country. This is an example of a nationalistic American Muslim. Risk management, we've become better at doing that. One time, after 9/11, we used to spend lots of money, but now the money's not around so much, so we have to be better risk managers and think about not just terrorism, but a whole range of other things that can affect our lives. And we focus now on things like business resilience and so on. This is Reaper, which is one of the UAVs that's used over in Pakistan. Very effective, but the rockets are too big for the kind of tasks that they have, so they're developing smaller rockets now, which will only take out a single room rather than a whole house. Because what happens is you get a meeting of men in one room, and you've got the women in another room preparing meals and so on, and the children. And if you take out the whole house, you kill a lot of collateral damage. So the aim is to try and reduce that by using smaller missiles that will just take out the room with the men up. So that's the aim at the moment. Targeted killing, of course, Mahmoud al-Malu. That was the case involving Mossad and people using Australian passports. Again, as I say, Israel, Russia and the United States are the only ones that engage in targeted killing these days. And I think it's, to a large extent, counterproductive. Other international drivers. Actions of Muslim states to repress Muslim populations in places like Iraq and Bahrain. The knock-on effect of violent change, such as in Syria and Pakistan. Perceptions of US government double standards. In particular, the loss of US human rights credibility. I think it's very difficult for the US to criticize countries like China when the US doesn't have a very good human rights record in recent years. And I think that the balance is swinging back again. The Americans are very, I suppose, the systems in America do eventually correct themselves. And of course, they've swung too far to the extreme side of security after 9/11. Israel's actions and rhetoric, I think, are often an inflammatory aspect of international relations as well. One of the reasons why the people in Bahrain aren't getting supported is because of the US bases there. And you've got a minority Sunni group who are, and the majority are Shia. And so it's not democratic at all. And in terms of double standards, the US does support democracy, but on a fairly subjective basis. Syria, no telling where that's going to end up, but it's going to create, obviously, a lot of instability in the Middle East and create lots of problems. And the irony, of course, is that the United States and Al-Qaeda are on the same side here. So, interesting situation. Waterboarding, I think, very a dangerous activity to engage in because, again, once you lose the moral high ground, it takes a long time to get it back. And of course, the dilemma of what to do about Israel's rhetoric about striking Iran. I think that the deal was done that the United States wouldn't draw attention to or wouldn't complain about settlement building provided Netanyahu doesn't go ahead with planning a strike on Iran. But there's a lot of sort of interesting byplay there. And of course, the Israelis are continuing their settlement building, and that's going to continue to be a factor which will continue to make it difficult to have any kind of resolution internationally, because so many groups use that as a rallying point or recruitment feature. Other drivers, Muslim frustration over a range of issues like the Indian control of Kashmir, Russians are what they're doing in the Caucasus, Israel, Palestine, southern Thailand, Mindanao, Chinese repression in Tibet and Xinjiang. Then there's lawless environments that allow terrorism to thrive, such as in Somalia and Yemen. And then there's the action of some nation states to support terrorism in neighbouring countries, such as Iran, Turkey and Pakistan. So if you look at Kashmir, there's been 3 wars fought over Kashmir, and the line of control runs through basically the middle of it now. Pakistan controls the north, India controls the south, but there needs to be some resolution. China's taken a big chunk of the eastern side, but there does need to be some resolution of that, because as long as Kashmir remains a dispute, then Pakistan will continue to support terrorism. The Russians are not prepared to let go in the Caucasus, which are predominantly Muslim, and because of strategic and economic reasons. China's similarly engaged in Xinjiang in particular because of it's important from an economic and resource point of view, and so they're transmigrating Han Chinese to Xinjiang, and now there are more Han Chinese there than there are Uyghurs, who are the native population. So you have a democratic solution. You can vote for whether you want to be part of China, but since the people who would be voting now are in the majority pro-China, you know what the outcome will be. The new front in the war on terror is, of course, various places, but particularly parts of North Africa, Somalia and Yemen. And as you can see there, they're the areas that are mainly Muslim. Somalia and Yemen, a lot of refugees going from Somalia to Yemen at the moment, but Yemen itself is a mess. And there are 2 insurgencies going on in Yemen, and Al-Qaeda is doing very well, I think, in Yemen. The difference with the Yemen commitment is that of Al-Qaeda is that it's focused, it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, because it was run effectively by Anwar al-Awlaki, who's now dead. The focus was on the United States and international attacks. In terms of Syria, that's, there's a lot of external interference there, and it's no telling where that's going to end up, because the groups that are in opposition to the government don't have a common viewpoint, and they don't agree with the people outside the country representing them, so it's really a difficult situation. Other drivers, Muslims trying to change the governments in their own countries, as in Indonesia and other places. Muslim assertion of identity in Western countries, where they may be treated with suspicion. Encouragement to terrorist violence by clerics, and successful terrorist attacks, which may or may not actually be taken through to a conclusion, but would still be useful from a public relations point of view or propaganda point of view. So some examples of that: we've got Indonesia, where JAT is now the sort of the main group. Jemaah Islamiyah is no longer sort of feature very much, but there's lots of small groups in Indonesia. In terms of Muslim integration, it works well in some places, not so well in others. I think in the United States it's worked pretty well, in fact. Britain has a huge problem because of a very large number of people who have not integrated very well, mainly from Pakistan. Mostly, I think, in Australia, Muslims have integrated pretty well, and you've got an example there of a girl who's now in the surf life-saving movement, and but then you've got a little advert from America, which is by a neo-Nazi white supremacist group. So it's a mixed picture. We think that we do pretty well with integration, but of course the Cronulla riot showed how, in 2005, how that can sort of come apart fairly easily. These are a couple of the clerics, Abu Hamza in the UK, who's in jail at the moment, and Ben Bricker, who is also in jail. He's an Australian cleric involved in what was called Operation Pendennis, planning to do an attack in Victoria. He's in jail, and apparently he's radicalising people in jail, so he's not sort of obviously recanting. And I mentioned about sort of attacks that might not be successful, but still are very useful from a propaganda point of view. And this is an example, Times Square 2010 with Faisal Shahzad. He screwed up on the making of the explosives, but nonetheless, the fact that an attempt was made did frightened the Americans and got a lot of publicity and so on. So effectively it was successful from a terrorism point of view, even though nobody got killed. Other drivers, the grooming of young children to become jihadists, and generally unquestioning. Anger over large-scale immigration from third world countries within Western countries, and fixated persons who don't really fit into it very neatly into anywhere else, but I thought that that was the best place to put them, and I'll explain about that. But these are examples of young people being prepared to become suicide bombers. A lot of the attacks in Afghanistan are by very young people, you know, sort of teenagers, and apparently, you know, some of them have been groomed who are actually below the teenage level. But they are often sent to these schools by their parents who want them to have an education, but then the education they get is not really what the parents had expected. But then they're sort of told that they're going to become a martyr and so on. So they effectively, I suppose, file them off with that. This is an example of anti-immigrant, or actually it's immigrants protesting against racism in Greece. But I thought this was quite an interesting comment because it came from Australia, this one up here. The arrogance, don't they realise they're immigrants? They don't belong there, full stop. This makes me so angry. I can't even say what I'm really thinking here. Holy crap. That's actually, although it's an international website, that comment has come from Australia. So there's obviously a few people here who don't like immigrants. Fixated threats are a problem because they are people who, and I saw them from time to time when I was working in the government, there are people who become fixated about somebody in particular. They're not like Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd or whoever it is, and sometimes they plan that they're going to attack them. So they're a problem from a close personal protection point of view, CPP point of view. In the UK, they have a good system because they work with mental health authorities if they think somebody's becoming potentially violent, and they will then either ensure that they get medication or counselling or whatever. Whereas we tend to just let them go. When I was in defence, there was one person who threatened the chief of the defence force, and we contacted AIIA. They said, well, you know, we don't have the resources to be following all the nutters around, and the AFP said, no, we can't do anything until they do something. So we had a parade for the farewell of one of the generals and the chief of the defence force, and this guy tried to attack him on the parade. Now, had he had a knife, then he might have caused some problems. As it was, he broke the wrist of the vice chief, who intercepted it very well. But nonetheless, I mean, that was a potential danger. You might remember a few years ago when Prince Charles was visiting, and a Cambodian guy jumped up on the stage and fired a starting pistol to get publicity for Cambodian refugees. But you know, some of these things can come out of left field and you don't really expect them. Some of the things that are changing, I suppose, from a terrorism or terrorist perspective, obviously the gradual decline of Al-Qaeda, more regional Islamist activity in places like North Africa, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. The primary target is still, of course, the United States, mainly because of Afghanistan, and the effects of the US is, I think, pervasive liberal culture, which we're all, I guess, exposed to and absorb, but it's much more, I suppose, seen as a threat in Muslim conservative countries. North African and Middle East groups are still, I think, considering how to make the Arab Spring work, and they were caught badly out of step by the Arab Spring because they hadn't anticipated it, like most people hadn't, and they're still playing catch up. Anyway, this is may cause some interest, I suppose. When No Easy Day comes out, it's a book by one of the SEALs who was involved in SEAL Team 6, which was the one that took out bin Laden. But now his account is that bin Laden put his head out into the corridor and they shot him in the head, and they never had a weapon. And that account that was, you know, where he was reaching for a weapon was made up at the time. Anyway, the US government's annoyed about this and is threatening to take him to court. But of course, if they do that, then it's adding credibility to his account. So they're a bit caught on this one. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And in terms of ranking of the threats, Al-Qaeda in Central in Pakistan, this was last year, was still seen as the main problem. But you can see there that the others, this was done by Selective Wisdom, which is a website that supposedly canvasses intellectuals. And that was their ranking of the problem areas. But obviously, the affiliates are becoming more of an issue for Al-Qaeda. And of course, you know, the perceptions of America, some places are very negative. As I say, the Arab Spring, it's played out very differently in different places. And there's no really one-size-fits-all, I don't think, for the Arab Spring. It seems to be very different in different places. Anyway, other things from a terrorist perspective are that it's harder for persons of interest to travel anonymously to Western countries. The extreme right-wing and anti-immigrant attacks occurring in many developed countries these days, coming from a non-Islamist element, obviously. I think it's better, they think it's now better to focus on promoting homegrown terrorism and the lone wolf attacks as being playing to our vulnerabilities. Obviously there's more reliance on the internet on the part of terrorists, and the need to continually innovate to retain the initiative. Just to give you some examples of that, US and other border controls. Interesting thing with America is that they're very focused on the border in the south, and yet all of their problems from terrorism point of view are coming from the north. So it's sort of an interesting situation. I was based in Washington, and I used to go to Canada frequently, but there were some roads you could go to Canada where you actually didn't go through border checks, which was interesting. I think that's changed now, but this is an example of one of the extremist attacks in America, which happened recently against a Sikh temple by a white supremacist. This is a lone wolf attack in France, you might remember recently, with this Mohammed Merah, where he shot a number of French soldiers. So the focus now is more on the homegrown lone wolf aspect, and this is a document produced in the United States that focuses on that issue. Inspire magazine is very important for terrorism, for Islamist extremism, because it's really the main, I suppose, interface with the public. And it's got lots of advice on how to do things, how to make bombs and so on. And you can access it on the internet. And in the area of innovation, you know, this was an attack where they were trying to bring down a cargo plane going to the United States, and the explosive was in a cartridge, printer cartridge. And the Brits were tipped off about this being in the cargo, or they were told that there was an IED, improvised explosive device, in the cargo. And they went through the cargo and couldn't find it. So the Americans then went back to the Saudis, which was the source for the information, and said, you know, can you be a bit more specific? So they actually came up with the tracking number, and then the Brits found the item, but they didn't realise it was an IED, and they broke it open. Unfortunately, they disrupted it in the process of doing that, and rendered it safe. But you know, it was put together in a very sophisticated way, and would have, you know, had that not been a tip-off, it most probably would have worked. That was made by Siri, the guy I showed you first up. Anyway, it's easier to attack, obviously, Western targets closer to home, people like visitors, expats, and so on. If you're a terrorist in Pakistan, that's much more accessible to you. But of course, it's not going to be as effective in changing your target country's policies. Another concern is that the flow of weapons out of Libya to North Africa, particularly to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is included MANPADS, which is man-portable air defense systems, which in other parlance is surface-to-air missiles, which can be used against airliners. So there's a lot of those out there now, which is a concern. Obviously, terrorists rely more now on couriers because they're worried about national security agency and signals intelligence. But then that creates a vulnerability if you can track the courier, which is what happened with bin Laden. There's the distraction, I think, for extremists of the issue of Sunni versus Shia. Sunnis don't regard Shia as being acceptable Muslims, and so there are a lot of attacks against Shia internationally. they're about 10% of Muslim Shias, and probably close to 90% would be Sunnis. So the Shia are usually on the defensive. There's only, I think only Iran and Iraq have a majority of Shias. All the other countries, Sunnis are the majority. Anyway, in terms of, this is an example of an attack that's taken place, in this case against Israeli diplomats, because it's very hard to conduct attacks in Israel. This is just about the flow of weapons to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb from Libya. This was the tracking of the courier back to bin Laden. And of course, he was killed in the attack. And this is an example of one of the Sunni versus Shia outcomes there with the Al-Askari Mosque in Iraq, which, as you can see, has been pretty much devastated by a large bomb. The aim of the Sunni extremists in Iraq is to try and provoke a civil war and partition of the country. And I think 88 people I saw in the paper today died in Iraq yesterday, so very large numbers of people still being killed there. So what are the things that are not really a problem for terrorists? Well, firstly, finances. Straight after 9/11, that was seen by some people in the intel community as being the vulnerability of terrorists. Obviously, secure communications is not a problem for them, and I'll explain why. They've got plenty of access to propaganda platforms. They have no problem recruiting, particularly in youth-bulge countries. They've got access to information and data mining in a way that's never been possible before. And they've got access to homemade explosive ingredients, HME. So if you're a terrorist in somewhere like Australia and you're planning an attack, you just go and borrow the money. You know, why would you? You don't need to do anything else. Just go to the bank and get a loan. So, because you know you're not going to have to pay it back. So it's easy to get financed. In terms of secure communications, there's encryptions called Mujahideen secrets, which is a way of encrypting data, which is building on pretty good privacy, which is another form of encryption. This is an article in Inspire about how to encrypt your emails. While we might be able to decrypt them, it might take us longer to decrypt them than it's worth our while. So it took us, say, a month to decrypt it, and it was about something that was going to happen in 2 weeks. We're wasting our time, obviously. Although it might be a very simple message like that one. Yeah. Also, they're using Facebook now. I noticed the Mormons are also making big use of Facebook, but so are terrorist groups to build up friends and people who might be supporters. Hezbollah was recently removed from Facebook. Country with youth bulges. Many of the places that we're concerned about in North Africa and South Asia have got large numbers of young people. So high unemployment, lots of young people equals lots of ready recruits. This is also from Inspire about how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom, written probably by Samir Khan, who was American educated. So he's got mom with an O. And these are some of the things that you can use to make explosives. So, pretty simple. Areas of innovation. I think that there's certainly more commitment to Islamist extremism, but maybe not to become a martyr, except maybe in South Asia or Iraq. Online training is being used a lot nowadays. The AFP, for example, have been using Call of Duty as a way of preparing for an attack on the airport in Canberra. But so terrorist groups probably been using those kind of games as well. I've certainly seen examples where they've been playing adapted games for the first-person shooter, third-person shooter, group shooting type stuff. And it's very handy if you're training with that kind of stuff, that you can actually develop skill sets in building up logistics, conducting attacks, all that sort of stuff. And you can do it all online these days, or with games that you can purchase. They're becoming very good at using IT technology. The attacks in Mumbai in 2008, they used Google Earth, and they were using Blackberries and so on. Use of new types of homemade explosives, which can surprise us, and use of apps that can also facilitate terrorism. There are probably 100,000 plus, I think, now, apps You probably have a better idea than I have. But some of them are quite good from a terrorism point of view. Anyway, just some examples of all of this. Promotion of Islam. We make it easier for people to promote extremism in the West because of civil liberty views. This is an example of, I think that's Call of Duty, which is how to plan a special forces operation and carry it through. This is use of Google Earth. This is the High Court in Delhi, which would be handy to have that if you were planning an attack. You can actually get the same thing for ISAF headquarters in Kabul, which is very good if you were planning a range for a mortar attack, for example. But the attack in 2006 in the UK, or the planned attack using liquids, sorry, 2008 was, using liquids, of course, confounded people because they hadn't thought about that. But in fact, explosives can be made from gas, they can be made from liquids, made from solids, made from gels. So pretty much anything can be made into an explosive if you've got the right ingredients. And this is the use of one of the apps for sniping. You can use an iPhone for sniping. It's very good in terms of the, it knows where the phone is, so it can work out what the wind direction is, it can work out what the altitude is, it can work out the humidity and all those kind of things, which are all things you need to know if you're a sniper. And other areas of innovation, some are very simple. One way that they've been creating a delayed effect in some places is to use ice. So what you do is you immerse a grenade, say 2/3 of it in water, freeze the water, then you pull the pin and leave it. And of course, once the water melts, the grenade will detonate. So it's and they do the same thing in Iraq with rockets firing at bases there. So they've got time to disappear before the incoming fire. Some of the other innovations. This was interesting because there was it hasn't been mentioned publicly, but planned attack on the Eurovision Song Contest by a group out of Dagestan to get the publicity. But a couple of innovative things was they used liquid explosives, which they then soaked into newspapers. Then they dried the newspapers, and the newspapers would have then become explosive. But of course, they'd pass through security. And the other thing they were planning to do was to use model cars containing explosives and run them into the this building, the Crystal, what it was called, Crystal Tower or Crystal House, or whatever they called it. Anyway, they were going to run them into there and detonate them. And it wouldn't have caused a lot of casualty, but of course, being Eurovision, it would have got a huge amount of publicity. This was a guy in America who was planning to do attacks with model airplanes. And these are quite, substantial airplanes, could carry a fair amount of explosive. I mean, they're not going to do a huge amount of damage, obviously, but it's more about the publicity than it is about anything else. These were guys who were planning to do paragliding. There was a previous attack in Israel, which was one with 2 Palestinians using a hang glider, powered hang glider, where they killed 6 Israeli soldiers before they were killed themselves. So they're always looking for ways to innovate to overcome security. Anyway, what's happening from our point of view? Some of the things, and this is the last of my slides, you might be pleased to know. Declining CT budgets. What's happening there is that every area of government is now having to make economies, and including the security intelligence areas. And so there's declining budgets for counterterrorism. Also, there's now more of an emphasis for security intelligence to focus on counter-espionage, mainly because of concerns about China and Chinese espionage activity in Australia and other places. So after 9/11, probably ASIA would have gone 90%, something like that, counter-terrorism, and 10% counter-espionage, and that allowed a sort of a situation to develop where it gave the advantage to people engaging in espionage. And so now the balance is being redressed, and I expect that ASIA might go back to something like 60% counter-espionage and 40% counter-terrorism. So effectively, that's another reason why resources will be taken away from counter-terrorism. Defence intelligence areas are having to put more emphasis on China now, so because of the concerns about nation-state threats. There's also the issue of cyber threats, both cyber espionage and and cyber crime, not so much cyber terrorism. That's obviously going to take a lot of resources. General Alexander, who's the head of the National Security Agency in the US, said that what we're actually seeing at the moment is the greatest transfer of wealth in history due to espionage and cybercrime. And companies that think they haven't been attacked are ones that probably don't know they've been attacked. So it's a major problem in the business sector. Public complacency, obviously, now that we're sort of 11 years on from 9/11, hasn't been any successful attack in Australia. People are becoming a bit ho-hum about terrorism. But as I pointed out, more people are dying in terrorist attacks now, far more than was the case 10 years ago. Obviously, there are international developments that could have a knock-on effect elsewhere. For example, if Israel did a strike on Iran, that could really sort of be like poking the beehive. There's the nexus between crime and terrorism, which varies from one place to another. But Dawood Ibrahim, I showed you initially, he's a Muslim who was responsible for the 1993 bombing attacks in Mumbai, and is now probably the leading organised crime figure in the Middle East. There's jurisdictional issues between the states. We still haven't overcome that problem. Clearly, our adherence to human rights and the rule of law does, to some extent, mean that we're fighting with one arm tied behind our backs. But I think it's better to do that than to go down the route of waterboarding and all that sort of stuff. There's the issue of people being released from jails now, who are convicted maybe after 9/11, who are now sort of served their time and being released. Some of them who are not sort of being changed by the experience, maybe even radicalised. Certainly people coming out of Guantanamo who weren't radicals when they went in seem to have been radicalised in Guantanamo. And I think generally there's a failure to focus on the right problems and to allocate resources appropriately.